Wings over a Kingdom, February 8, 1946, Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. The morning air was thin and cold, drifting over the highlands like a whisper from the mountains. On the outskirts of the capital, the old Lideta airfield buzzed with an energy few in Africa had ever seen. Soldiers in khaki uniforms stood at attention. Court officials in crisp, white shama robes clustered near the tarmac, murmuring quietly beneath the rising hum of propellers. At the center of it all stood Emperor Haile Selassie, the Lion of Judah himself, small in stature, but towering in presence. His dark, alert eyes followed the gleaming silver fuselage of a Douglas C-47 Skytrain as it roared to life. The engines coughed, then steadied into a deep, commanding growl. Painted across its side, in bold green letters, were the words, Ethiopian Airlines. Few believed this moment would come. Just a decade earlier, Ethiopia had been fighting for its life, invaded by Mussolini's Italy in 1935, bombed by planes that darkened its skies with poison gas and fire. The nation had no air force then, no aircraft of its own, only courage and defiance. Now, in the wake of war and liberation, the emperor was determined that Ethiopia would never again be grounded. Haile Selassie stepped forward, his uniform pressed, his medals gleaming faintly in the morning sun. He paused before the aircraft steps, his words deliberate and calm. Let this airline be a symbol of our freedom and our progress, the wings of Africa as future. Nearby, a small team of American pilots from Trans World Airlines, TWA, adjusted their caps and checked their clipboards. Ethiopia had partnered with TWA to train its first crew and run early operations, a bold move for a country still ruled by a monarch in a continent where colonial flags still marked every border. But the emperor wasn't interested in being taught dependency, he wanted mastery. As the first Ethiopian passengers boarded, government officials, royal aides, and to journalists, the crowd erupted in applause. A priest swung a censer of frankincense, blessing the aircraft. The propeller swirled faster, slicing through the highland air, echoing off the mountains like a heartbeat of progress. Then, with a surge of power, the C-47 lifted from the runway, the first official flight of Ethiopian Airlines. Dust and petals swirled in its wake. From the ground, thousands watched it ascend over Addis Ababa, their eyes following it into the blue horizon. For many, it wasn't just a plane, it was a promise. The aircraft banked north toward Cairo, the first route in what would become a vast network across Africa. From inside the cockpit, Captain Jack Beeson, an American TWA veteran, smiled at the sight of the rugged Ethiopian plateau stretching below. Beside him sat a young Ethiopian trainee pilot, Mengesha Jiber, his hands steady on the controls. Beeson leaned in and said, half jokingly, "One day, you'll fly this thing without us." Mengesha smiled. "That's the plan, Captain." Back on the ground, Haile Selassie stood still as the plane disappeared into a streak of cloud. Around him, his advisors whispered of the cost, the fuel, the foreign contracts, the skepticism of Western governments who doubted an African airline could last a year. But the emperor wasn't listening. He saw beyond it, to a continent still colonized, still grounded. Ethiopia would lead by example. To fly, in 1946, was to defy gravity and expectation both, and that morning, Ethiopia did both. The Sky Teachers and the Dreamers, March 1946, Lideta Airfield, Addis Ababa. The smell of jet fuel mixed with roasted coffee beans from a nearby stall, an oddly fitting scent for a country learning to fly. Inside a hangar that doubled as both classroom and workshop, a group of Ethiopian trainees gathered around an American instructor from TWA, Captain Robert Houston. He stood in front of a chalkboard filled with diagrams of wings and engines. The men listened intently, notebooks open, pencils sharp. These first recruits came from every corner of Ethiopia. Some were sons of nobles, others young soldiers who had served during the Italian occupation. None had ever flown before. They were handpicked not just for skill, but for something the emperor valued even more: loyalty and discipline. Houston pointed to a schematic of a propeller. "You don't just fly an airplane," he said, tapping the board. "You feel it, you read the wind, the pressure, the balance. It talks to you, you just have to listen." In the corner, a quiet young man named Alamea Hutekel took careful notes. He had grown up near Lake Tana, herding cattle before the war. Now he was learning the mechanics of ADC-3, the same model that had carried Allied troops across Europe just a year before. The idea that he might one day pilot one himself still felt unreal. Every lesson was a struggle. The manuals were in English, the instruments labeled in foreign terms. The Americans were patient but strict. TWA's job wasn't to run an airline for Ethiopia, it was to teach Ethiopians how to run their own. For that, Haile Selassie had insisted on one condition: every position, from maintenance to cockpit, must have a local understudy. Outside, the airfield grew busier each week. Flights to Asmara, Cairo, and Nairobi began to take shape. Mechanics tested engines in the open air, clerks learned ticketing, scheduling, and the complex dance of radio communication. Addis Ababa, once isolated by mountains and gravel roads, was becoming a hub that connected Africa to the skies. At night, the Americans and Ethiopians gathered at a small mess hall near the airfield. They'd eat injera with lentils, drink tella beer, and swap stories. The Americans talked about flying over the Pacific during the war. The Ethiopians spoke about the struggle to reclaim their homeland from Italy, and the emperor's years in exile. Through broken English and laughter, a shared respect began to form, but not everyone celebrated this progress. In the city, some nobles muttered that the emperor's obsession with aviation was wasteful, a royal toy for show. Others feared foreign influence. After all, TWA was American, and the Cold War shadow was already lengthening. But Haile Selassie had played this game before. He wasn't building Ethiopia's airline to serve Washington or London. He was building it to serve Africa. By 1950, the airline had expanded to include more routes, more aircraft, and crucially, more Ethiopian crew. One of them was Mengesha Jiber, the young trainee from the inaugural flight. On his first solo run to Khartoum, he felt the same nervous excitement he had seen in Captain Beeson's eyes years earlier. The control tower crackled over the radio. Ethiopian 301, you are cleared for takeoff. As the engines thundered to life, Mengesha gripped the controls, remembering Houston's words. The plane talks to you. When the wheels lifted off, he smiled. He wasn't just flying an airplane, he was flying a dream that had started with a monarch who dared to imagine Africa in the sky. The emperor's vision takes flight. Addis Ababa, Imperial Palace. The emperor stood by a large window overlooking the city, his hands clasped behind his back. Below, Addis was transforming, roads being paved, ministries built, schools expanding. Ethiopia was no longer the isolated kingdom it once was. Airplanes now slice through the sky daily, their trails painting proof of progress across the blue. Haile Selassie turned to his advisors. Our airline, he said softly, is more than transportation. It is education. It teaches the world that Africa can stand, organize, and fly. By now, Ethiopian Airlines had become the pride of the nation. The green, yellow, and red insignia on its aircraft carried symbolic weight, a living emblem of African independence. At a time when most of the continent was still under colonial rule, Ethiopia's planes were landing in capitals that didn't yet have their own flags. The emperor knew this was power, soft power, but power nonetheless. Inside the airline's headquarters, the atmosphere was disciplined but alive. Ethiopian managers, once assistants to TWA staff, were beginning to take the reins. Local engineers, trained by American mentors, handled maintenance with precision. Flight attendants in tailored uniforms greeted passengers in Amharic, English, and Arabic, symbolizing a new cosmopolitan Ethiopia. Among them was a young woman named Escale. She had joined the airline as first group of female flight attendants, something unheard of in most of Africa at the time. On a flight to Cairo, she stood poised, professional, and proud. Her mere presence was revolutionary, an Ethiopian woman, representing her nation thousands of feet in the air, serving diplomats and businessmen from around the world. The routes expanded steadily: Cairo, Nairobi, Khartoum, Aden, Rome. Ethiopian Airlines became the bridge between Africa and the Middle East, connecting nations before they even had embassies. Each new route was celebrated with ceremony, priests blessing the aircraft, officials shaking hands, and the emperor's portrait displayed in the cabin. But progress came with tension. In Washington and London, diplomats debated Ethiopia's growing independence. Some argued that TWA's contract gave the Americans too much influence. Others whispered that the emperor was using aviation to project political dominance in East Africa. Haile Selassie ignored the noise. He was focused on something greater, preparing his people to fully take over. By the mid-1950s, that moment arrived. The TWA partnership began to phase out, and Ethiopian nationals assumed leadership across all divisions. The airline dropped airlines and became Ethiopian Airlines, a subtle change, but one loaded with symbolism. The Americans had left, but the sky remained Ethiopian. One of the final acts of transition came during a board meeting in 1957. Sitting at the head of the table, the emperor addressed his newly appointed Ethiopian executives. "You must now fly not as students, but as masters. Remember, this airline is not mine, it is Ethiopia's, and through it, Africa will see what is possible." That year, Ethiopian Airlines joined the International Air Transport Association (IATA), standing shoulder to shoulder with carriers from Britain, France, and the United States. It was the first African airline to do so. In the years that followed, Ethiopian pilots began training others, not just from Ethiopia, but from Ghana, Nigeria, and Sudan. What started as a royal project was becoming continental. The emperor's vision was being realized, an African-led aviation powerhouse in a world that never expected one to exist. And yet, this success was only the beginning. A greater test awaited, one that would push the airline to its limits and prove whether it could truly soar beyond its imperial roots. Turbulence and triumph. Addis Ababa International Airport. The runway shimmered under the midday sun as a new aircraft taxied into view, the gleaming silver body of a Convair 240, Ethiopian Airlines' first pressurized, fully modern passenger plane. On the tail, the green, yellow, and red tricolor gleamed against the sky. Crowds gathered to watch, cheering as the engines cooled. The announcer's voice echoed through a tinny speaker. "Ladies and gentlemen, Ethiopia enters the jet age." But behind the celebration, winds of change were gathering. The 1960s brought political tremors across Africa. Colonial empires were collapsing, and newly independent nations were looking for inspiration. For many, that symbol was Ethiopia, the only African country never colonized, now flying its flag across borders most were just beginning to draw. Haile Selassie, now an older man but still regal, saw the airline as a living extension of Ethiopia's diplomacy. He instructed his ambassadors to use Ethiopian Airlines not only for transport, but for representation. "Our planes," he said, "carry the image of our nation. Let them be seen everywhere." Ethiopian Airlines expanded aggressively, acquiring new aircraft. The Boeing 727 jet in 1962 made it the first African airline to operate a jet-powered plane. The inaugural flight to Nairobi drew headlines across the continent. Newspapers called it Africa's leap into the jet age. In the cockpit that day was Captain Alamea Tekel, the former trainee who once studied in a dusty hangar. His co-pilot was a younger recruit, one of the many Ethiopians now trained entirely in-house. As they cruised at 30,000 feet, Alamea looked out over the clouds and said quietly, "When I first touched a plane, I didn't know where it would take us. Now, I think we're taking Africa with us." The passengers applauded when they landed. Some cried. It wasn't just a flight. It was a statement that Africa could lead in technology, logistics, and global presence without colonial oversight. Still, the skies were not always friendly. The 1970s brought storms. Political unrest spread at home. Students protested against imperial rule, demanding reform. In 1974, the monarchy fell. Haile Selassie, the man who had founded Ethiopian Airlines and guided its vision, was deposed by a military junta known as the Derg. For the airline, this was an existential moment. Many thought it would collapse without the emperor's protection. But it didn't. In fact, it did something remarkable. It adapted. Under state control, Ethiopian Airlines faced new pressures but maintained professional independence. The board kept much of the management intact, preserving the values of discipline, training, and efficiency established decades earlier. While the country faced famine and revolution, the airline kept flying. It connected Ethiopia to relief efforts, brought in food supplies, and evacuated citizens when needed. Employees whispered stories of quiet defiance. Pilots who had flown under the emperor continued to wear their uniforms with pride. Ground staff kept the maintenance hangar spotless, even when fuel was scarce. "We serve the sky," one mechanic said. Politics changes, but the sky doesn't. By the late 1980s, Ethiopian Airlines had not only survived, it had grown. It expanded routes into Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. It remained profitable when many African carriers failed. The rest of the world took notice. This wasn't a relic of monarchy anymore. It was a world-class airline run by Ethiopians, respected for its precision, discipline, and reliability. When Haile Selassie's portrait was removed from the company walls after the revolution, no one replaced it. Instead, a new motto was quietly adopted: the new spirit of Africa. It captured what Ethiopian Airlines had become, not a symbol of one man's vision, but of a nation's endurance. And decades later, as Africa's skies filled with new flags and fleets, one name still soared above them all: Ethiopian Airlines. The airline born under a crown had outlived the crown itself. From monarch's dream to modern giant Addis Ababa, 1990, the old Lideta airfield had long since closed, replaced by a sprawling international airport at Bole. The roar of modern jets now echoed where prop-driven planes once stood. On the runway sat a Boeing 767, sleek and proud, painted in the unmistakable green, yellow, and red. Across its body was written a simple name that had outlasted empires: Ethiopian Airlines. Inside the terminal, staff moved with quiet confidence. Many were second-generation employees, sons and daughters of those early dreamers who detrained under TWA and flown with the Emperor's blessing. The legacy was alive in them, but their mission had evolved. The airline was no longer a symbol of monarchy. It had become a symbol of national competence, an African success story built on discipline, foresight, and pride. In the boardroom upstairs, CEO Girma Wake addressed his team. "We are not competing as an African airline," he said. "We are competing as a world-class airline that happens to be African." His tone was calm, but his message clear: Ethiopian Airlines would never settle for regional status. It would lead. The 1990s and 2000s became decades of transformation. The airline modernized its fleet, joined global alliances, and opened the Ethiopian Aviation Academy to train not just local pilots, but Africans from across the continent. Students arrived from Nigeria, Kenya, Zambia, and beyond, all eager to learn from the one African airline that had truly mastered the skies. Every graduate carried the same spirit that Haile Selassie had envisioned half a century earlier: self-reliance through mastery. In classrooms filled with simulators and instructors, they studied weather systems, flight navigation, and emergency response. Outside, the hum of engines from training planes filled the air, just as it had in 1946. In 2011, Ethiopian Airlines joined the Star Alliance, the world's largest global airline network, the first African carrier to do so. The moment was celebrated across the continent. From a post-war monarchy to a global aviation powerhouse, Ethiopia's journey had come full circle. By 2020, the airline had become Africa's largest and most profitable carrier. It flew to over 130 destinations across 5 continents, carrying millions of passengers each year. Its fleet included the Boeing 787 Dreamliner, one of the most advanced aircraft in the world, and its pilots were among the best trained anywhere. And through it all, the airline remained wholly Ethiopian-owned. In a global industry dominated by foreign investment and privatization, this independence was rare. It wasn't just business, it was identity. The green, yellow, and red tailfin became more than a flag. It was a signature of pride and endurance, seen from Cairo to Cape Town, from London to Beijing. In quiet moments, older employees still told stories of the Emperor, of the day he blessed the first C-47 on the dusty runway at Lideta, of his words about freedom and progress. The new generation listened, not with nostalgia, but with recognition. Because even if the crown was gone, the vision had endured. Africa, flying on its own wings. Today, when an Ethiopian Airlines plane takes off, it carries with it nearly 80 years of history, born from monarchy, forged through revolution, and sustained by discipline and belief. It is the proof of what can happen when a nation refuses to be grounded, even when the world tells it not to fly. The story of Ethiopian Airlines isn't just about aviation. It is about what happens when vision meets resilience, when a small kingdom dares to build something that outlasts its kings. If you enjoyed this story, Subscribe for more deep dives into Africa's untold history, where visionaries, rebels, and dreamers shaped the continent's future one bold act at a time.